So I was going to do some introductions, but I feel like this is kind of family here a little bit.
Kind of.
So I'm going to maybe just cut to the chase because I'm pretty excited to hear.
But she doesn't know who you are.
Oh, really?
I only know you as me.
Oh, my God. Wow, what a horrible host. Okay. So here we have today Professor Sarah Haley. She's an assistant professor of gender studies here at UCLA. And she's going to be leading us in an examination today of the Georgia penal system. And here we have Yasmin, who I know you know, but she is UC President's postdoctoral fellow with the Department of English at UC Riverside. And she is going to be leading us in a discussion of the right of women prisoners to self-defense. And if I ever misspeak, please feel free to cut in and correct me. Here we have Professor Dylan Rodriguez, Professor of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. He'll be taking us on an examination of the influence of racial genocide on our systems of state-sanctioned violence. And here we have Professor Erica Edwards, Associate Professor of English at UC Riverside. She will be taking a look at Blackness as a source of security in our post-9/11 world. And I'm so excited about just the interdisciplinary nature of this panel. And with no further ado, I think Professor Haley will be starting. Sure. I'm still so impressed that you figured this thing out.
Might be the best thing. Okay. Each evening, my grandmother, tired and worn, retraced her steps home, laid aside her mask, and re-entered herself. These words, which powerfully expose the toll of whiteness as property, appear within the introductory pages of the article we are here to appraise. There are many historical and legal actors in the article, but one that is often unremarked upon is Professor Harris's grandmother, Alma, the first person we meet in this influential piece. As a historian of African American women, for me, these pages serve as more than a mere opening or entry into the brilliant legal analysis that follows. Alma's history and the history of other Black women expose the gendered operation of whiteness as property. How might these histories help us to understand the gendered life of whiteness as property? And how did the carceral state produce and reproduce whiteness as a gendered property right? Professor Harris's work, Whiteness as Property, as well as other of her essays such as Finding Sojourner's Truth, Race, Gender, and the Institution of Property, is a powerful intervention in the field of Black feminist scholarship. So influenced by her work, which is really an analysis of power and place, specifically the place where white supremacy and economic domination meet, and those are her words. I want to think about whiteness, womanhood, property, and carcerality in African American women's history. Professor Harris describes her grandmother Alma's migration from sharecropping terrain in what she calls Anywhere, Nowhere, Mississippi, to Chicago in the 1930s. And she manages to get a position in the department store because her employers read her fair features and the very act that she would dare to apply for such a job as evidence that she was white. She narrates the toll that this means of survival had on her grandmother. In Harris's words, for Alma, quote, accepting the risk of self-annihilation was the only way to survive. I want to return to the place from which Alma came, the terrain of Anywhere, Nowhere, Mississippi, the South and Southern penal institutions in the early decades of the 20th century. Women imprisoned at Mississippi's most notorious penal institution, Parchman Farm Penitentiary, described the strain of imprisonment, and one of the most common forms of violence they described was that of familial separation. Professor Harris's article begins by situating the operation of whiteness as property in the market and in the home, right? She's recalling her experience of observing her grandmother and the impact that had on her family. So it's in the arena of relationships between mothers, daughters, and grandmothers. Women writing from Parchman in the 1930s echo this idea. Mrs. Barnes, I received a letter from my sister, and here's what the letter said. It said, I'm sorry, I hate to tell you, mother is dead. I wonder, oh Lord, I wonder, will I ever get back home? My father's dead and my mother is blind. I'm behind these bars trying to build this time. Well, if I die on this parchment farm, please, Captain, send my body home. Will he be young? I wrote and told my mother to try to get me home, and I will never leave her in this mean world alone. Fanny Walden. My mother is old and feeble, I know. My father died 19 years ago. One poor little daughter in the world behind. For home and her love, my heart doth pine. These reflections, which are part of an archive of blues songs written by women in Parchman, Mississippi in the 1930s, these reflections, much like Professor Harris's article, connect the legal and familial, public and private, love and terror. And a few of these songs were recorded. The expectation, affirmation, and protections of whiteness operated in gender-specific ways. White women had an exclusive right to protection from the harrowing life of Southern imprisonment, a gendered and racial entitlement that exempted them from the violence of familial estrangement that imprisonment imposed. In this way, one of the gendered expectations of whiteness was the security of institutional protection of family bonds, family time, and affection. If feminists rightly pointed out that the home constituted a sort of a prison for many white middle-class women, it also meant exclusive protection from legal, institutional, and carceral intrusion into that sphere. And for Black women, it meant just the opposite, right? The legal, institutional, and carceral imposition of longing for, missing, and dreaming about home and the families contained within it. It meant the burden of missed final words between daughters and parents. The gendered, affective, and emotional toll of not possessing a property right in whiteness was devastating. Another Mississippi-born Alma described through song a gendered manifestation of whiteness as property in the 1930s. There ain't no mercy here, Lord, she argued. Catching this long line is killing me. It's so many women here and so many different kind. Some high yellow, but I'm a chocolate brown. In her unrecorded song, Long Line, Alma recounted the long sentence and impossibility of escape from prison, the sun-up to sundown workday she endured. As Alma points out, in Mississippi's prison farm, the many different kinds of women who toiled alongside Black and white men were all Black. No white women suffered there. And Alma was not Cheryl Harris's mother, Alma, another Mississippi Alma, was not the only woman to sing about the labor at Parchman, as well as what Robin D.G. Kelly calls freedom dreams.
So we never, never leave me alone. So we never, never leave me alone. Leave me alone, good Lord, leave me alone. Leave me alone, good Lord, leave me alone. Some folks are tired of justice, so they go. I come to fight for justice, police home. Police home, good Lord, police home. I come to fight for justice, police home. Wake up, Rosie, tell your midnight dream. Wake up, Rosie, tell your midnight dream. Midnight dream, good Lord, midnight dream. Wake up, Rosie, tell your midnight dream.
In some ways, the devil in this song is a gendered incarnation of whiteness as property, and like the women who sang it, Alma likely dreamed of escape. Although she was in captivity in Mississippi, Cheryl Harris's grandmother Alma managed to move to Chicago and obtain a job as a department store worker. Of course, that did not mean she could escape the virulence of white supremacy. Jobs at department stores were closed to Black women, but they represented a new moment in American history, and specifically the history of women and gender in the United States. So for the rest of my time, I want to think about Black women, department stores, and modernization. we are more familiar with the history of white women's entrance into the paid labor force than we are with the violation of black women in Southern prisons. And indeed, there's a wealth of important scholarship on white women's entrance into waged work, their role as engines of commodity consumption in this period, and the emergence of a new social and cultural sphere, a heterosocial sphere of amusement. In short, it's the emergence of the new woman in the late 19th century and early 20th century South. So she has access to the new commodities she could buy in department stores and a modicum of newly acquired independence from men. And this spate of department stores, restaurants, movie theaters, dance halls, amusement parks, and dime entertainments popped up all over Atlanta, the South's unofficial capital, marking a new era of Southern commerce and play and industrialization. But the emergence of this new woman who worked for wages in the urbanizing and industrializing South had an intimate relationship to the black women who were barred from such employment. And it's not just because black women performed domestic service for them. In the South, criminalized black women built the infrastructure for the new cultural and economic sphere of commercial leisure and consumption. And here I am speaking quite literally of the building of things. The newly developed downtowns with their brick facades required, well, brick, along with paved streets and county roads, railroad lines and coal, and the source of labor for these sectors was the unpaid work of prisoners. Convicts worked for private companies in all of these industries in mining, agriculture, lumber, brick, road construction, the major industries of urban development. And only black women were put into convict lease camps and chain gangs. And here I mean, they were the only women who were put on these chain gangs and convict camps. They were the only women who became the object of property. And only white women could use, enjoy, and escape the grueling labor because of their exclusive right in the property of whiteness and gender normativity. So here I'm referencing Professor Harris's seminal work on use and enjoyment and expectation in her essay. Black women languished in convict lease camps alongside black and white men. So the condition of possibility for the new woman and the economy in which she was central was the usability of black female bodies at hard labor. The expectation of gender normativity was a form of whiteness as property. Black women were imprisoned by the thousands in convict lease camps and chain gangs. They had to endure the agony of back-breaking work, of broken limbs crushed by falling trees, of sunstroke deaths, of burns that they sustained because they had to wake up at 5 a.m. and cook and clean and mend the clothes for all of the prisoners at the camp before they actually went to do the work that the camp required. So they did the reproductive and productive labor for those convict lease camps. Beginning in the 1870s, imprisoned women were, black women were put on rock-breaking street brigades. So they were incarcerated alongside, they were put in all women's rock-breaking camps. So they broke up the rocks, and then paid workers filled the streets with the rocks they broke up. And this was a new initiative seen as a monumental advance toward industrialization and the construction of what everyone hailed as good streets in Atlanta for the pedestrian traffic of these new commercial districts. They said that there would be enough rock broken up to pave every street and then build a wall around the city. In 1884, a 20-year-old black woman named Ella Gamble was given a life sentence and sent to a convict camp operated by Chattahoochee Brick Company. Prisoners would make brick, construct the brick for the facades that I talked about. She was pregnant when she arrived at the camp. 20 years later, when she applied for pardon, she had been diagnosed with cancer of the womb, and her lawyer reported that her condition declined dramatically on account of the heavy work she had been compelled to do since her confinement. Ella Gamble is an example of just one of these many women who worked in these brick-making camps. They had to push the clay through the rectangular mold, then fire the bricks in coal kilns. One of them would have to stand just far enough away from the kiln so as not to be burned, so they could toss the bricks into these big ovens. And a predominantly female crew made 40,000 bricks in the blistering Georgia summer of 1884. They also worked in lumber production for the wood for these buildings, They were part of a group of prisoners who laid the railroad lines, making Georgia the 5th leading state in the country in terms of the amount of railroad line that it laid. And it was #1 in the South. They were often sent to these camps for misdemeanors and municipal crimes like cursing in public, throwing dirty water in the streets, or prohibition violations, right? Drinking or selling whiskey. When the automobile became widely available, they needed paved interstate roads and highways. This became increasingly necessary in the 1910s to the 1930s. So you can probably guess right now where I'm going with this, right? Black women were charged on chain gangs in this point with constructing and paving those roads. Only 4 white women were ever sent to Georgia's chain gangs, compared with 2,000 black women. And this is because in 1908, Georgia passed a law allowing for judicial discretion in the sentencing of women prisoners, so that women prisoners were to be sentenced to the state farm and given light work, but this discretion obviously only applied to white women. And as I said, many black women were sentenced to convict camps for minor offenses. 3 black girls ranging from age 11 to 16 were sent to the chain gang for malicious mischief. What did this mean? Well, according to the charge, unlawfully and with force and arms, willfully and maliciously destroying the flower pots and flowers of 3 white residents in Albany, Georgia. For an 11-year-old girl, picking flowers or knocking over flower pots considered desecration of private property. It meant becoming property, her young body used as the material for industrial development and the sphere of new white womanhood. To wrap up, the gendered expectations that governed a property interest in white womanhood irrevocably shaped the construction of cities, cultural and economic landscapes of modernity, to devastating effect for the black women who were confined and forced to labor in these new terrains. Perhaps we might think of this as a historical precursor for the current globalized post-industrial economies grounded in mass incarceration, a regime to control surplus labor and the bodies of people of color. And we might think about how we could use Professor Harris's insights about the development of whiteness as property to our current global context, marked by the growth of service sector labor, late capitalist economy structured in globalization, interconnected regimes of deregulation and regulation, financialization and securitization. So if historically whiteness as property functioned to maintain the sanctity of white homes, and as economics and history changed to allow white women's exit from the home, so it did both, it protected the home and allowed white women to enter new spheres, we might also think of whiteness as a security, as a financial instrument, perhaps similar to a mortgage-backed security, which is the bundling of hundreds or thousands of mortgages into one asset. The mortgage payments for each of those houses go into big pools, and dividends are paid out to investors who bought shares of that assets, right? The bundling of mortgages. And these mortgage-backed securities were a big part of the crash of 2006, because when people could no longer make the mortgage payments, the assets in their entirety collapsed. In some ways, an economy structured in racial capital relies on such financial instruments. Whiteness functioning as a racially backed security comprised of a multitude of assets, including bodily protection, labor advantage, familial autonomy and stability, and gender normativity, which raises the question about what sort of radical structural and institutional refusals to pay, right? How might we refuse to pay as people did who could not pay their mortgages? What kinds of refusals to pay might be necessary for the collapse of our economy structured in whiteness as property?
And, yeah, just, without further ado, yes, please.
So fun.
Yeah.
I'm so glad I got to hear that in person. I hope we get to talk a lot more.
Yes, definitely.
Hopefully.
You know, I just want to say, I was thinking we would reserve time for
questions at the end, if that's okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I won't use my presentation time for Q&A, but I would like to. But my project really has a lot of dovetail with yours, and I'm kind of at the beginning of my thinking through it. I'm really excited to be a postdoc fellow and be able to do some real archival research that will kind of help flesh out these ideas. But at this point, they're still kind of in the kind of gestation stages, and so I wanted to kind of share with you kind of how I'm thinking these things together. So in Whiteness as Property, Cheryl Harris suggests that the right to have rights is not merely a matter of social standing in the present, but a claim on the expectations one has for one's future. And I'll let you know, I have a philosophy background, and I tend to get, especially at the beginning of projects, a little bit kind of abstract. So if it becomes kind of too abstract, I can slow down. So she says, whiteness as an object over which continued control was and is expected, was an object over which continued control was and is expected. The protection of these expectations is central because, as Radin quotes, our personhood depends on the realization of these expectations. So claims to personhood are, by her account then, claims on time, orientations towards the realization of a precarious future, one which we might not yet own, but to which we feel entitled. For subjects whose futures are deemed the property of the state, the property of their masters, or the property of not their own, any deviation from the future others want to realize for them risks criminalization, and as such requires not only the power of an undivided will, as modern liberal subjectivity would lead us to believe, but more contingently the common sense recognition that that will is reasonable. My interest in scholarship that historicizes social constructions of whiteness as both a claim on the future and a technology of dispossession is inspired by the writings of Harriet Jacobs and her fugitive desires for freedom. In this paper, I want to think Jacobs' slave girl abolitionism as a kind of orientation to the future that, like many political expectations of its era, was passed on to the descendants of American slavery through a phenomenology of self-defense, an orientation to the future through which anti-slavery abolition yielded to anti-lynching movements and seeded the rise of prison abolition, black feminism, in the latter half of the 20th century. This is a phenomenology of self-defense that diverged from the tenets of possessive individualism precisely because it imagined a future that fell outside of what Harris in her essay refers to as the embrace of the law. The kind of domestic analogies implicit in that reference, I think, ought not be overlooked. At the end of her narrative, Jacobs points out that she and her children, as manumitted slaves, are, quote, as free from the power of slaveholders as are the white people of the North, and though that, according to my ideas, is not saying a great deal, it is a vast improvement on my condition. The dream of my life is not yet realized. The kinds of freedom Jacobs' narrative imagines were deeply suspicious of the provisional entitlements liberal domesticity would afford. To live as an enslaved woman within the loopholes of domestic virtue that permitted slave masters to rape and kill with impunity required an understanding of the domestic order of both slavery and abolition that would survive long past the victory of constitutional emancipation. Jacobs' abolitionism then anticipated the violence emancipation permitted in the afterlife of slavery, the sanction of rights bearers to appropriate black bodies as extensions of their will continued in various forms throughout the era of Reconstruction and into the 20th century. From the legal loophole of the 13th Amendment to the social disenfranchisement of agricultural and domestic labor, Jacobs' testament attests to the nationalized forms of domestic violence slavery concealed. So her narrative was published in 1861 on the eve of the Civil War, and though the rise of the prison abolition movement wouldn't arrive for another 100 years or so, Jacobs' testament to the wrong of slavery critiques what Angela Davis in 1975 deems a dialectic of rape, a systematic dispossession of black women's right to sexual autonomy that placed a claim on her future that extended from the Middle Passage to the present day. In a 1975 issue of Ms. Magazine, Angela Davis theorizes a dialectics of rape to explain the mutually reinforcing logics of white supremacy and patriarchy that threatened to make acts of rape and lynching justifiable long after the institution of chattel slavery was lawfully abolished. In her article, Davis identifies Joanne Little as one of the most, quote, recent victims in this racist and sexist tradition and the cultural grandchild of Cordelia Stevens, a black woman raped and lynched outside Columbus, Mississippi in 1915. In retaliation for the destruction of a barn her son was rumored to have set on fire. In 1975, the 1975 case then challenged common sense notions about when the will to self-defense was reasonable, for whom, and on what grounds of evidence. The suspicion that accompanies claims on the future of black bodies made by and on behalf of, claims on the future of black bodies made by on behalf of the people themselves are, as Davis writes, the cultural grandchildren of slavery and lynch culture. They are social texts, like the slave narratives that preceded them, subject to the mediation, misappropriation, as well as co-optation of those who seek to claim their future as their own. The public record of these texts are sites of discursive struggle between lawful claims to the right to self-defense and those acts deemed merely criminal and punishable by law. So what draws me to Jacobs is that though she clearly sees the constrictions of the medium she persists, that she writes in, she persists in finding a way to write, publish, and disseminate her abolitionist message throughout the free states and across the Atlantic. Despite the all-encompassing nature of the foreclosures of her dream of freedom she encounters, she pushes on to pass on her story and her claim to its future, and her claim to its future to those who would live to inherit it from her. In this way, we might see her loophole of retreat, the crawl space that she finds as refuge for 7 years while working to ensure she and her children's freedom from slavery in the future, as a metaphor for the kinds of claims fugitivity can afford. There was then and remains today a discursive disconnect between the ethical import of family, property, and protection of their future espoused within universal politics of liberal domesticity and self-preservation, and those oriented towards a kind of collective representation of an all of us or none politics against the liberal entitlements of personhood itself. The language of contract, incorporation by the national body requires, often renders the difference between identity politics and a shared political identity obsolete. While identity politics gain not yet persons access to the master's house, the tools of incorporation she encounters, they require that she exchange her commitment to the struggle for the provisional comforts of self-preservation. As Robin Kelly so aptly suggests, whatever cul-de-sac we might have entered, the Enlightenment train will not lead us out. These people assume that the universal humanism they find so endearing and radical can be easily separated from the historical context of its making. Indeed, that is precisely what can undo the racism and modern imperialism it helped to justify. Their critical defense of the Enlightenment, which includes a strange tendency to collapse Marx, Locke, and Jefferson into the same category, betrays an unwillingness to take ideas, let alone history, seriously. Kelly's point, made 20 years ago now, makes the connections between Jacobs, Little, Davis, and Stevens all the more haunting. My research aims to suggest that the common sense notion of self-defense is a historically constructed imperial project and a remnant of the time of slavery designed to preserve and serve existing property relations among politically recognized persons through both the legal and extra-legal apparatuses of the state and local municipalities. When used to secure an individual's freedom, these paradigms remain loyal to their masters' desires and dreams of the future. By attending to the intersecting histories of racially gendered and class structures of surveillance, criminalization, capture, and punishment that stabilize the difference between just and unjust acts, my intention is to read these social texts as fugitive claims to time already claimed by another. That, to me, kind of encompasses what the process of abolition is about. It's about reclaiming time and reauthoring its orientation to the future, to a different kind of future. So these claims offer a series of discursive disorientations of history, strategic retreats from conventional paradigms of liberal domesticity and its appreciations of property as first and foremost an extension of one's will for self-preservation. It escapes towards a future that is not yet realized but collectively esteemed as reasonable. Claims on the future which are rooted in a radical tradition of anti-slavery abolition. And so in the project, there are a couple sites that I want to kind of take this theoretical framework and use it as a lens through which to do some more historical work. One is kind of the inaugural moment of prison abolition and looking at it particularly gendered manifestations at Alderson Women's Penitentiary in West Virginia. It's the first federal reformatory bill for the incarceration of women in the United States. And they staged an uprising in the week following the Attica uprising in solidarity with the Attica brothers. And they were met by troops of men armed with sticks and gas masks, sparsely isolated in strip rooms, and transferred as far away as Kentucky and Texas. Their protocols of protest and the repression with which they were met elicited nowhere near the media attention or public scrutiny that the Attica uprising provoked. While the events at Alderson in September of 1971 hold a recognized place in new abolitionist histories of the movement, and I've cited a bunch of things, at first glance, the reasons, they usually are just a couple of lines and at most kind of elaborated by an informative footnote. At first glance, the reasons for such limited scholarly and activist attention to this particular case seemed axiomatic. No one died. It was a response to Attica. It was more of an instance of reactionary protest than an organic, continuous movement. It ended more swiftly. The prisoners were not held responsible for the deaths of prison guards. At the level of analysis, however, what distinguishes the case are the casualties. At Attica, the public response that the state troopers used of violent force to end the standoff was unreasonable. And at Alderson, strip searches and sending mothers south to impose separation upon their connections to family and friends was not unreasonable enough. So that's the first site. And then the second site is more contemporary and came out of was inspired by a conference that was held in honor of Angela Davis's Legacies in the Making, her mentorship and intellectual contributions to her students' scholarship. And as part of the conference proceedings, there's a film, a documentary included in the conference, and it was the very preliminary version of a film that has now since been released as a feature-length film called Out in the Night. And the woman who directed the film needed a place to stay, and so I offered up my apartment, and it became kind of this amazing relationship that really helped inform the trajectory of the rest of my work. So Blair's documentary was about a 2006 case in which a group of black women, lesbian identified, from Newark, were walking through the West Village and were attacked by a man who was sexually harassing them, and after defending themselves against a man that the New York Times would later call a quote would-be admirer, they were tried and convicted for gang assault and sentenced for prison terms ranging from 3 to 11 years. The group known as the New Jersey Four had a story too complex to gain the support of either mainstream black activists or mainstream LGBT groups, contained within a sequence of details and identities that held little claim to any future. Their survival required a community to recognize how unreasonable their sentences were in the face of the facts of the case. And so, I'm going to skip. I wanted to kind of connect these histories of dispossession and sexual violence to a play that Lynn Nottage wrote about women in the Congo. It's called Ruined. And I think the analogies that she draws in that play between both financial and physical forms of ruin, instances of both misfortune and decay, a dynasty in decline, a mortgaged future, are really important spaces for us to kind of think through the implications of rape being used as a weapon of war and the ways in which the Cold War against Black bodies has been kind of uninterrupted since the time of slavery. So as the play unfolds, I won't talk about that. So Incidents was and continues to be a controversial text, at least in part because its narrator, Jacobs, admits to her own embeddedness within slavery's domestic order. The orientation of her implication could not be willed away. The narrative is composed in the form of a confession, however, in ways Jacobs dreams of freedom offer literal and metaphorical loopholes of retreat from social legal discursive conventions, and are in no way the result of a personal failing. Harriet Jacobs' protocols of self-defense, her way of naming the unnameable, representing the unrepresentable, and defending decisions that would be otherwise criminalized, laid the groundwork in many ways for the discursive and political retreat of women of color from mainstream feminist claims to a liberal domestic future, for the retreat of prison abolitionists from the moderation of prison reform. Taking Davis's theorization of the dialectics of rape as my point of departure, I want to think through these objects of study, these social texts of domestic violence, around competing discourses of reason, a collection of codependent struggles over the very meaning of freedom. Rather than romanticize their individual histories as tales of heroism and personal resilience, I read in them a disavowal of the racial dynasty preserved within the rape culture of the plantation South, and passed on through its rationalization by history as a reasonable perversion of the will to power.
Dylan, I hope you guys don't mind that I'm actually using your first name, because I feel really weird about it.
Prefer it. Good morning, the 6 of us, 7 of us, counting me. So Whiteness is Property. It raises for me 2 theoretical problems that inspire, kind of undergird some of the thinking that I'm going to share with you this morning. First, that whiteness is itself, in its multiple ongoing moments of enunciation, a declaration of gendered racial war. Second, and intimately related with that property relations are in their very particularly American iterations, and by America I mean the Americas, structured in the relation of chattel and land expropriation, which is to say, relations of racial and racial colonial genocide. So my talk kind of occurs in 2 moments. Part 1, introduction, genocide as racial colonial power. Our problem is genocide as a genesis of gendered racial and racial colonial power. The capacity to eliminate populations, geographies, ecologies, and ways of life remains the epical potential at the heart of global racial modernity and its long historical present, up to including and likely exceeding the so-called post-racial. What we're confronting then is, in suggesting a specific conception of racial and racial colonial genocide, is a totality of power that structures and permeates virtually every form of differentiation, hierarchy, external identification, e.g. criminal and racial profiling, military police mobilization, jurisprudence, national development, and environmental intervention, from the destructive to the allegedly protective, that affects the dispersal of human beings along what Black feminist thinker, philosopher, critic Sylvia Wynter identifies as modernity's fatal racial continuum, the devastating distinction between what she calls the selected and the disselected. The latter category for Wynter encompasses what she calls, quote, the category of natives and niggers, end quote. What we are considering here is not the abstracted tedium of historical body counts, nor are we concerned with reciting empirical litanies that laundry list the seemingly countless empirical indications of a global white supremacist hierarchy of life and death. I want to say why. Partly it's through kind of pedagogical experience and political experience as well. This kind of data, the body count data, is readily available and has been for at least several decades. I've become more and more unconvinced that simply restating that data, no matter how much you yell it, will even remotely alter the devastatingly binarized global conditions to which it testifies. So I actually don't think reciting the empirical historical record does anything. I think it actually reifies the condition more than it does inspire liberationist, abolitionist, feminist, queer, etc. interventions on it. So instead, I'm asking that we struggle to form a more acute political theoretical literacy around the stakes of oppressive racial and racial colonial violence and the various forms of creative insurgency that attempt to resist, interrupt, abolish, and transform the historical material terrains which it produces and through which it is experienced. What if struggles against gendered racism in all its modalities, from the chattel and the colonial to the juridical and the aesthetic, are, in their historical logic and urgent immediacy, not only struggles against brutality, police military brutality, disfranchisement, inequality, but also insurrections against a global life order? Wherein genocide, concept of genocide, theory of genocide, an abolitionist anti-genocide praxis, wherein genocide, in critical discourses of race, gender, sexuality, disability, nation, neoliberalism, indigeneity, religion, geography, and so forth. These questions I believe, form a capacious challenge that's been engaged by a fairly relatively small number of radical thinkers, and which can and must be addressed by other communities of activists, teachers, artists, legal workers, writers, including those engaged with the work of ethnic studies, American studies, women's studies, queer studies, gender studies, and other critical interdisciplinary, counterdisciplinary practices. Part 2, the hegemonic dead. There are two hegemonic apparatuses through which genocide has come to be institutionalized and implemented as a form of modern knowledge and jurisprudence. On the one hand, there is what we might call a legal regime on genocide that's been structured by the overlapping United Nations human rights and international juridical infrastructures. The field of genocide jurisprudence moves from the common understanding that the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, hereafter the UN Genocide Convention, ratified in 1951, forms the essential basis for any viable engagement with genocide and thus privileges law and rights as the political, cultural, and institutional registers through which genocide is to be defined, arbitrated, and otherwise interrupted and engaged. On the other hand, there is an academic regime on genocide, dominated by a field called genocide studies, which encompasses this professional scholarly work discourse that's crystallized since the 1980s and has convened in an identifiable field of academic journals, high-profile anthologies, conferences, and circuits of scholarly debate. But like Yasmin, tons of citations here, which I won't bother to share.
Yeah.
You can just take my word for it. Both the legal and academic regimes on genocide are in constant flux, and the debates therein are both contentious and messy. In other words, I don't mean to simplify or kind of create this so-called straw person thing about this. These are complicated fields. While a comprehensive diagnosis and critique of these hegemonic regimes can be undertaken here, I have 15 minutes, it's nonetheless possible to characterize some of the defining elements of their overlapping problematics. The legal regime on genocide is characterized, in my view, by 5 structuring concerns. Legal definition, that is the legal definition of genocide. Juridical criminalization, which I'll emphasize more in a minute. Third, the paradigmatic construction of a perpetrator-victim dyad. That's how the entire apparatus works. There's perpetrators and victims. And perpetrators have to be actually identified. They tend to be, if not individuals, identifiable organizations, states, state-like organizations, and so forth. Fourth, establishing the proof of intent. For folks that are familiar with the UN Genocide Convention, that's the most controversial part of it, is the intent clause. So there's a lot of legal discourse focuses on this, what intent actually means in genocide. And lastly, clarification of what precisely the United Nations jurisdiction is. That debate is fueled by the tension between international jurisprudence and the kind of acknowledged right of states to have autonomy and self-determination in mediating disputes. So those are the 5 kind of sketch elements that I think structure the field of the legal regime. The point I'll raise here is merely that the juridical regime does not only attempt to produce a relatively stable legal standard through which genocide can be addressed, prosecuted, and ostensibly remediated through international jurisprudence, but that it also has the far-reaching effect of tethering a politics of genocide, a politics and discourse of genocide that is a politics of genocide that both conceptualizes and struggles over what genocide means, and which actively attempts to resist and abolish the conditions that produce and sustain genocidal conditions. The legal regime has a way of tethering this politics of genocide to the institutions, epistemological frameworks, and punitive logics of criminal law. Thus, as with all criminal law regimes, the hegemonic legal regime on genocide actually works to decriminalize forms of violence that seem to otherwise clearly fit within the conceptual spectrum of genocide. It does this at the very same time that it criminalizes and infrequently prosecutes incidences that are deemed worthy of formal legal recognition as genocide. This decriminalization of genocide occurs within both the epistemic and procedural structures of the legal regime. Put more simply, legally non-recognized forms of genocide, such as cultural genocide, racial chattel genocide, ecologically centered genocide, historical genocides of land displacement, we could go on, are both implicitly condoned and effectively sanctioned by the modern legal regime on genocide. It's worth noting that the bulk of these epical historical violences would in fact not be recognized as falling within the scope of the modern legal regime really in any register, from the definitional to procedural and otherwise. Now, arguably the most insidious dimension of the hegemonic academic regime on genocide, on the other hand, entails its foundational, well, this is going to emphasize, entails its foundational and largely under-theorized adherence to the assumptions and conceptual structures of a white Western humanism. In fact, much of the academic regime betrays a paradigmatic attachment to white supremacist humanist universalism that surfaces in presumptive conceptualizations of the ideal human subject who is to stand before the academic and legal apparatuses as victim, testifier, truth teller, survivor, and advocate. The ideal rights-bearing or potentially rights-bearing subject is prototyped in the Western white liberal subject, whose rational self-determining sociality unfolds outside of and alienated from the conditions of acute and perpetual vulnerability to the physiologically, culturally, spiritually, and subjectively disintegrating, degrading, terrorizing, and exterminating violence of the New World civilizational racial text and the modern Western ensemble. Following Saidiya Hartman, Alyosha Goldstein, Andrew Wolford, and a ton of others who stress the ontological violence of gendered racial and racial colonial power, it becomes, to me, rather clear and virtually indisputable that the genocidal totality or totalities produce conditions of subject and community formation that force some to involuntarily inhabit mourning, grieving, loss, terror, and irreparability as a primary lived structure of subjectivity and social identity. Such an inhabitation significantly precludes, if not preempts, such people's capacity and willingness to negotiate the structure of racial qualification that guides the academic regime's recognition of genocide's proper victim subjects. I know that was a mouthful, but we can talk about it more in a minute. In other words, this is the very way in which whiteness as property enters into the structures of the hegemonic discourse, academic discourse, particularly on genocide. To the extent that the white humanist fantasy tacitly underwrites the coherence of academic and juridical discourses on genocide, the capacity to engage the problem of genocide as a racial and racial colonial problem will remain delimited by a white supremacist critical circuit. So it seems clear that there are some significant pitfalls to the legal and academic regime's institutionalizations of a particular definition, discourse, and juridical mobilization around the terms of genocide. That leads to part 3, the logic of evisceration. There are a few specific points I want to elaborate in conceptualizing what I'd like to reference as gendered racial and racial colonial genocides constituting logic of evisceration in the hope of eventually offering it as some kind of theoretical political tool. So for the sake of our time, I'm just going to give you all 3 elaborations of how I'm trying to think about this. Of course, I can talk more later. So first, the idea of evisceration, with its root meaning in the Latin word for disembowel, or more literally to remove the viscera, puts a particular focus on violence that is waged against the comprehensive realm of the individual and collective physiology. Evisceration names the unbreakable connection between the psycho-spiritual and physical-biological experience of world-altering violence. It brings attention to how different forms of genocidal terror, desecration, threat of sexual violence, symbolic degradation, may exert drastic physiological consequences: depression, suicide, paranoia, cancer, even in the absence of direct physical brutality. These forms of genocidal violence have always had indelible effects on racially and racial colonial oppressed peoples' physical health, their capacities for biological and social reproduction, their collective efforts to sustain generations as coherent and self-aware groups, tribes, and peoples, and so on. This is why the distended historical and multi-generational experience of evisceration must be distinguished, in my view, from social, civil, or biological death, as well as from biopower, necropolitics, and Eurocentric states of exception. Pardon me. Second, and briefly, the logic of evisceration illuminates how the inception of race as a global physiological signification has formed a complex technology of violence and terror in and of itself. Here I just want to say very briefly, the conceptual is also already the genocidal. The moment of racialization is the inauguration of a hierarchy of life and death, an assemblage that both anticipates and is the absolute precondition for the capacity to materially initiate. And by materially, I don't just mean military, I'm also talking about the materiality of discourse and culture and aesthetics, right? This is the precondition to materially initiate the fatal systems of such an order. Third, a deeper focus on race as a gendered technology of genocidal violence helpfully challenges some of the hegemonic gender meta-narratives surrounding genocide and genocidal war. Now, anecdotally, I'm especially responding to a number of academic works that tend to install this notion that melts into presumption that historical target communities of genocidal mobilizations tend to be what one author calls non-combatant battle-aged males, right? Which is somewhere between the ages of 20 and 40, and they're civilians, right? So the point of how the genocide gender meta-narrative names it is that it's these civilian men, combatant age, who are not actually in militaries that are the primary gendered objects of genocidal violence. So I'm responding and thinking about that. Within regimes of genocidal violence, principally racial colonial conquest and racial chattel social formations, the lived categories and abstracted classifications of gender and sexuality are subjected to distortion, transgression, and manipulation, mutilation as a matter of the infrastructural emergence of the gender genocidal regimes themselves. In other words, that dominant gender meta-narrative I'm talking about is not tenable if we actually think seriously about racial colonial genocide and their technologies of violence. Cultural and juridical attacks on the biological female womb, both material and imagined. Colonialist and chattel constructions of birth, status, inheritance. Again, this helps us think about the importance of Professor Harris's work, free, unfree, citizen, non-citizen property, and propertied. And discursive constructions of women and genderqueer people as objects of genocidal violence suggest the need for a critical theory of racial and racial colonial genocide that focuses on the logic of evisceration as an actively gendering form of power. This is, again, against the dominant discourses. Genocidal violence does not merely come to bear on already existing statically gendered bodies, but is itself engaged in the process of forcefully defining and redefining, making and remaking gender and gendered sexuality as an integral aspect of its world-deforming power. So in conclusion, I want to propose inhabitation of racial and racial colonial genocide. Maybe it's the underside of refusal, right, that we were talking about. Maybe it's part of it and the underside of it. But I want to suggest inhabitation of racial genocide, racial and racial colonial genocide, as the impasse from which a critical and radical creativity might emerge. I'm interested in a form of scholarly activist inhabitation of the logic of evisceration that links to a longer genealogy of insurrection, radicalism, and revolutionary struggles, which we've just heard about here, that dare to position the abolition of genocide and genocidal social logics as the only tenable ethical position, and the position through which a lived humanity and practices of freedom are possible for those who inhabit the logic of evisceration. In my view, this is a feminist question, it is an abolitionist question, it is an anti-racist question, it is a queer question, it is a liberationist question. Thank you.
Cheryl Harris's 1993 article, Whiteness and Property, has changed how scholars throughout the humanities, like me, approach the study of race. This paper engages that pivotal article's legacy in Black feminist studies and literary studies in order to discuss the shifts in racial formation that took place over the last 2 decades when the U.S. transitioned from the Cold War to the War on Terror, from affirmative action to diversity, and from the Bush regime to the Obama era, and to consider how whiteness and property offered a prescient critique of what was only then beginning to solidify as a public culture that extended the privileges that historically accrued to whiteness to a global overclass of color, whose job it was to represent and speak for enlightened, multicultural Western power. Considering then how safety continues to function as one of the essential entitlements of whiteness, even as it is now quite paradoxically sutured to public expectations for Black empowerment, I'll briefly discuss the writings of one of the architects of contemporary security discourse, Condoleezza Rice, to explore the transformations in racial formation that were coming into view precisely as whiteness as property was changing what we know about race, property, and U.S. citizenship. Whiteness as Property's signal contribution to the study of race in America is its linking of property rights to the country's history of racial domination and to American regimes of identity and personhood. Because the law recognized and, quote, protected expectations grounded in white privilege, these privileges became tantamount to property that could not permissibly be intruded upon without consent, Harris explains. Of course, if the privileges of whiteness as property determined the shape of social, political, and economic relations throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, they also gave shape to American citizenship itself. As Harris writes, whiteness conferred on its owners aspects of citizenship that were more valued because they were denied to others. Indeed, the very fact of citizenship itself was linked to white racial identity. If the tethering of racial identity to property defined American citizenship as one of the entitlements of whiteness, a significant question arises when we consider the conditions of what Omi and Wanant called the post-World War II racial break, a large-scale transformation in the codification of racial difference in the American public sphere. As the U.S. rose to global dominance in the wake of World War II, Omi and Wanant explained, white supremacy and official anti-racism, that is, public discourses of racial equality that leave structural inequality intact, emerged as coextensive racial projects. The break constituted what Jody Malamet calls a new worldwide racial project, a formerly anti-racist, liberal capitalist modernity that revises and partners with and exceeds the capacities of white supremacy without replacing or ending it. In this case, our important question is, how do we understand the relationship between race and property after the simultaneous opening up and contraction of citizenship for racial minorities following desegregation and the vast socioeconomic changes that resulted from the 1960s social movements? One way to get at this question is to consider the relationship between official anti-racism and the operations of security and policing on both international and domestic fronts as an extension of whiteness as property. That is, if we read the solidification of U.S. security culture in the post-45 decades as a racial project that transferred the privileges that were intrinsic to whiteness onto a larger field of racial signification, the catalysis of that racial project in the now 14 years since the September 11th attacks reveal how Black achievement serves as the transfer point between the exclusions of slavery and Jim Crow segregation and the inclusionist project of official anti-racism. In the culture of precaution that 9/11 both exposed and catalyzed, security checkpoints, see something, say something campaigns, renewed calls for civil defense, and everyday vigilantism were only the most visible indicators of a shift in the articulation of power that was necessitated after the Cold War by the introduction of new, unpredictable threats to the West. The emergence of a non-specific enemy after the fall of the Soviet Union demanded a change in security policy. The diversity of subjects of threat now called for a corresponding diversity in subjects of counterinsurgency and counterintelligence. The coming together of diversity initiatives and crisis management in the decades after Whiteness is Property was published changed the face of national security and the racialized expectations of protection and safety that attached to national defense programs. 1990s multiculturalism didn't simply transform Blackness from a badge of insult to a signifier of prestige. It also transformed the organizational cultures of security and counterinsurgency agencies, which were charged with managing unknowable and now indeterminable threats on domestic and international fronts as the U.S. rose to imperial dominance over the second course of the 20th century. Take for one example a 2008 article in the Black Collegian, a quarterly periodical that was founded in 1970 to promote the recruitment of college-educated Black professionals by American businesses. In an article discussing diversity initiatives in the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA executives seek to educate readers about opportunities for Black employees in their senior leadership positions. When asked why diversity in the CIA is important, the Deputy Director for Intelligence explains, "We need the diversity that the world presents right here in our workforce. We must draw on different opinions and different experiences when we're trying to understand complex global issues. It is actually the key to our success. The global issues and situations we face are complex, and we need to make sure that we're thinking about them in a sophisticated way," and so on and so forth. The incorporation of Black agents of defense into the armature of global security that solidified over the course of the Cold War and expanded during the War on Terror has been a key feature of what we have called the post-civil rights era. As Kathy Cohen argues in The Boundaries of Blackness, members of racialized groups have acquired such relative privilege in part because of the connection to and authority within marginal communities. Racial authenticity, that is to say, is not only assimilable into but indispensable to governmental power. And this is to quote Cohen. In a changing world where demographic characteristics are evolving in conjunction with economic and political changes, privileged marginal group members claiming authenticity within marginal communities, as well as familiarity with dominant practices, find themselves positioned as necessary components for the continued functioning of dominant institutions. If racialized minorities became essential to the function of private corporations as well as to police departments, government agencies, and the CIA and FBI, diversity management and domestic security worked together as the U.S. adapted to the global crisis caused not only by the changing nature of threat in the post-Cold War world, but also by the internationalist mobilization throughout the global South. In this way, diversity management was a critical strategy of what Dylan Rodriguez calls white Reconstruction, the post-1960s revival of white supremacy that took the form of increased surveillance, mass incarceration, and violence against peoples of color in the U.S. and abroad. If white Reconstruction or the post-civil rights era, whatever we want to call that juncture, demanded the incorporation of Black and brown agents of policing and surveillance into the governmental and social structures designed to protect the expectation that whiteness would continue to be an object that could provide relative protection from the brutalities of racial capital, post 9/11 security policy likewise uses the cover of racial equality to justify contractions of civil liberties which disproportionately affect communities of color. Witness how, for example, the USA Patriot Act, signed into law in October 2001, uses patriotism as a proxy for race, trading in on the historical equation of whiteness to property to citizenship, while at the same time incorporating language that dissimulates racial violence. It is the sense of Congress, the act reads, that one, the civil rights and civil liberties of all Americans, including Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and Americans from South Asia, be protected, and that every effort be taken to preserve their safety. Two, any acts of violence or discrimination against any Americans be condemned. And three, the nation is called upon to recognize the patriotism of fellow citizens from all ethnic, racial, and religious backgrounds. The Patriot Act redraws the lines of national belonging, writing Arab, Muslim, and South Asian citizens into the patriotic imaginary, while also solidifying the American terrorist binary that authorizes targeted killings and mass violence against communities of color around the globe in the interest of protecting white life and property. In U.S. popular culture and public culture of these last 2 decades, Black representatives of state power have both bolstered the imaginary of democracy and freedom and summoned the histories of Black anti-racist resistance. In this way, new Black political subjects manage threat while serving as the residual embodiment of it. In this context, the narrative of protection vis-a-vis respectable Black femininity that former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice weaves through her 2 memoirs, Extraordinary Ordinary People, published in 2010, and No Higher Honor, published in 2011, reveals the relationship between whiteness as property and Blackness as security. Rice's memoirs construct a model Black feminine subject at the vanguard of a post-9/11 imaginary of U.S. dominance. As she tells the fable of her paternal great-grandmother, Julia Head, near the beginning of Extraordinary Ordinary People, Rice routes familial honor through the depiction of the armed protection of Confederate property. She explains that her grandmother, Julia, was a favorite house slave who, quote, had run Union soldiers off the plantation and protected the horses during the Civil War. To the day she died, she would sit on her porch with a shotgun in her lap and a pipe in her mouth. Perhaps she thought she'd have to do it again. If the tale of Julia's Confederate heroics stretches the construction of ideal femininity to accommodate self-defense and pipe smoking, Rice's recollections of her mother conform to Cold War constructions of gender roles. Angelina Rice is introduced as an artist and a lady, a school teacher and pianist who didn't really believe that women should play sports or, heaven forbid, perspire. Even so, like Julia, Angelina is a paragon of strength. Rice remembers, for example, how an Easter shopping trip was interrupted by the prohibitions of segregation. We often shopped in Mountain Brook, a very exclusive white enclave outside of the city. At the Canterbury shop for children, they didn't seem to care what color you were, as long as you were willing to pay the exorbitant prices they charged. But on this day, we were downtown, and a clerk who my mother didn't know said I would have to try on the dresses in the storeroom. Mother looked her dead in her eye. Either she tries them on in the fitting room or we won't buy a dress here, she sternly replied. Make your choice. The poor woman shooed us into the dressing room and stood guard outside, hoping that no one would see us. It's significant that this incident is related as a rare encounter with white supremacy in segregated Birmingham. Throughout the memoirs in this passage, Rice is careful to turn stories of segregation away from brutality towards self-reliance, self-control, and strength. Here, as the saleswoman capitulates to Angelina's demands, Angelina's resolve, her grace under pressure, and her cool rationality connect the performance of Black femininity to the familial history of self-protection and self-reliance that the memoirs relate as the foundation for Rice's career in national security. Julia's and Angelina's attachments to the privileges of private property compel Rice to imagine white supremacy as a mere inconvenience to be overcome by refinement and self-cultivation. The memoir so detaches bodily safety from the expectations of whiteness, while at the same time, in Harris's words, masking the ideological content of racial definition and the exercise of power required to maintain it. Like the first memoir, No Higher Honor, published in 2011, reveals the racial epistemologies of U.S. empire throughout and after the Cold War, exposing a regime that makes global security contingent upon the careful management of knowledge about racialized populations and those populations' forms of resistance to domination. The second memoir carefully manages the representation of Rice such that she emerges as both the vulnerable feminine subject in need of national protection and the strong representative of a powerful state whose dominance is inevitable. Solidifying the overachiever persona that surfaces in the first memoir, No Higher Honor depicts Rice as a self-made professional whose upbringing in the mid-century South is always on display in her poise and grace. As she recalls visiting Buckingham Palace in November 2003, Rice refers to it as an experience that had an almost fairy tale-like quality. When we arrived, I was escorted to my room, she writes, where my own personal maid waited to unpack my belongings. I instinctively started to help her. Seeing that, Colin Powell, who was there with his wife Alma, another Alma, this guy from Alabama, with his wife Alma, said, "You're in her way. They've been doing this for 300 years." Here, Rice's mistake is more than a middle-class faux pas. It's a misreading of her script in a role of her role in a script of power relations inside a fantasy of imperial power. Powell's instruction is a lesson in the performance of power that compels identification with a royal we rather than a serving, laboring they. That the woman unpacking Rice's bags is referred to in the third person plural, so first you're in her way, then they've been doing this for 300 years, is significant. Without individuation, she stands in for an entire class and for a 300-year history of domestic labor. Rice's misreading of the script demands then her meditation on her route from Birmingham to Buckingham as a Black feminine subject. That night, Colin, Alma, and I had a drink in the sitting room. What would our parents think, I thought. Then Alma and I drank a toast to her father and mine. 2 little Black girls from Birmingham had come a long way. Then as Prince Charles escorted me to the elaborate dinner, as the orchestra played, this is my first time reading this out loud. Then as Prince Charles escorted me to the elaborate dinner, as the orchestra played God Save the Queen, I once again wished that I could tell my parents about this incredible experience. And so I did in a little prayer just before going to sleep. The image of the Black princess in the royal palace completes Rice's fairy tale of imperial power, which rests on both the mythical fabrication of monarchical splendor and the mystical conjuring of 2 Black patriarchs from segregated Birmingham. In this way, the image of the Black Southern belle sutures femininity to both vulnerability and mastery. Rice is both the little girl from Birmingham who hardly knows how to act in the palace and the powerful state representative who claims both a history of Black struggle that gets her to Buckingham and a future of global security and dominance. Because the explanatory frameworks of U.S. empire building since 1945 have depended on the rhetorics of racial equality and Black success, the incorporation of Black agents into the global networks of diplomacy, war, intelligence, and counterterrorism has served to justify the very U.S. multicultural exceptionalism that justifies the military actions and defense missions that continue to produce whiteness as a zone of protection and non-whiteness as a zone of vulnerability to premature death. Given this compact of Blackness with the expectations of safety emerging from the historical link between property, protection, whiteness, and citizenship, Cheryl Harris's statement near the end of Whiteness and Property that the property interest in whiteness is resilient and adaptive to new conditions has proven prescient indeed. Thank you.
I am going to, in Ernest's scheme, please go ahead and fire off questions. That was crazy. Wow. I'm in shock.
That's what we're doing.
It's really bad.
I have a, wow, this was a great panel, thank you. And they actually took a lot of notes. But, I actually just wanted to start off, I'll just throw one thing out there. And this is more kind of maybe a conversation or that's directed at Erica and Sarah's papers, because Sarah, you mentioned whiteness as security, and Erica mentions Blackness as security. So I don't really see those as like different, you know, but there's something that I wanted you to sort of comment on about how they're not really two different or distinct notions or concepts misconceptions or projects, right? Racialized projects, etc. So, not to put you on the spot, but it seemed very interesting to me how you each define them in those ways, and yet your papers, your presentations actually show how they're actually the same thing that you're talking about. So I don't know if you just wanted to extrapolate a little bit more from what you presented about that.
Erica's paper shows this amazing juncture, right, in which blackness has to become security for the means of protecting whiteness as property, right? You say white life and white property, and white life as property. And so that's one of, I think, the most insightful and amazing things about that presentation, which I really learned from. And it's ironic because I'm working on this other project about the 1970s, in which, right, in this, again, pseudo post-civil rights moment, in which it's the hiring of black prison guards and black police domestically, right? So it's the beginning of exactly what you're talking about, which gets globalized. That becomes part of the infrastructure of early mass incarceration, right? And there are so many overlaps. I'm dying to talk to Erica more about this because black femininity has a lot to do with that. And so I do think it's about historical change, right? And so what Erica ended with about the adaptability and whiteness and malleability, as Professor Harris says, of whiteness as property, I think is really right. I don't think it was trying to think if there's any way that blackness was security in 1910 in Georgia. I'd have to give that more thought, but you know, it's the same continuum, right? Of white supremacy and genocide, right? That's the only way to say.
Right. And I mean, I guess part of what I'm interested in is how all of these kind of public narratives of black achievement and black success in this historical moment are so dependent on these sort of early narratives of, you know, civil rights struggle. But even like the story that Rice tells about her grandmother, right? So there's this kind of invention of this, you know, sort of history of black self-defense that is all about, right, making a way to connect, to bring in those subjects who formerly represented exclusion and threat, and making those subjects now representative of, you know, these sort of promise of U.S. democracy. And so just trying to think about what that means for both the history of black women's labor, both in prison camps and outside of prison camps, and what it means for contemporary black women's labor in, say, the government or in the military. So,
Can I add to the discussion a little
Yeah.
bit? Because you just brought up 1910, right? And so you made me start thinking about this place of alleged security that becomes insecurity that black men soldiers play in conquest and colonization during around that period of time. And I'm thinking about Carter G. Woodson. I'm thinking about black male soldiers in the Philippines and other places where it's a kind of an early iteration of early prototyping of exactly the juncture that you're gesturing to, while at the very same time the soldiers themselves are writing home constantly, talking about how there is no security here, and that their engagement in the work of conquest is invoking for them apartheid back home. You know, so I think that there's something that is structuring about the tension that Deb's bringing up, the simultaneity of it, but also kind of the fatal absurdity of the idea of blackness and security, and that's the idea of it, but the actual initial instantiation of it, right? There's something like really deeply absurd in a horrible way, in a violent way about it.
In a lot of ways, that kind of gets to the inhabiting praxis that you're talking about, because by like owning the ways in which you're owned, like you kind of reconstitute the meaning of your dispossession. And there is an emancipatory kind of potential in that kind of reclamation. And that idea that Erica said that these figures manage threat while remaining an embodiment of it is precisely what Sarah was talking about about in terms of kind of race as a financial instrument of security. Like that idea of securing risk is about like making sure that the volatility of the market does not cause you to incur any costs to your own wealth. And in that way, we had the power the whole time. The whole point is to stop investing in other people's appropriation of it. So I think there is a kind of way in which, like, the metaphor of financial securities and the idea of like homeland defense have some prevalence there.
I have other questions, but
Keep going, yeah.
well, y'all might have questions of each other too, because there was a lot of overlap, you know. Well, just a few things that I wanted you to say a little bit more. I was really intrigued by your comments on the empirical data, and I was trying to take notes as fast as I could, but I just wanted to hear more about that and sort of like your critiques of how that's used or what that means to kind of like.
How much time do we have? No.
I'm always just really interested.
I'll give like
in
a fraction of that.
Yeah.
So part of my beef is, on the one hand, methodologically, and historiographically, that's why I titled that section "Hegemonic Dead," with the way, number one, that there's a paradigmatic privileging of white death, and people tend to forget that Jews under Nazi extermination were still considered white. Right? There's this kind of weird revisionist discourse where Irish and Jews are no longer white. They were white, primarily because Africans and others were seen as not white. Right? So not to mention that this is not to say that there was not entirely a genocidal racial discourse around Jews, and part of that around colonization of Irish and whatnot, but they were entirely white. So part of it is with that kind of the racial and racist and white supremacist methodological historiographical structure that produces the empirical record on the one hand. And then on the other hand, kind of the other side of that is with this this weird way in which Rwanda and other such so-called third world global south sites get privileged as places where kind of new non-European fascist genocidal dictatorial regimes get spun out of control and start exterminating their own people gets privileged as kind of like the post World War II moment in which this is what genocide looks like now. Right, there was industrialized killing, what Omar Bartov calls industrialized killing. There's industrialized killing over here, and now there's, Africans and Latin American dictators and so forth spinning out of control and exterminating and the tribal, genocide. So that's the other part of it is with that structure. And then on the other hand, there's the kind of the more dry attempts at actually compiling the body count for the 20th century, for example, in which there's these massive numbers that come at you, right, about how many people, and this is from the left, right, from the academic left and political left. There's a number of people from third world global south that got bombed by Europe and the United States. And the data we always hear about the prison industrial complex, massive colonization, policing. I don't think it changes anything. I actually think we follow that there's a tendency to fall into this liberal trap. That simply addressing people's ignorance of what has gone down and what is going down will somehow move them, and it fails to account for the power of a racist common sense, right? That should actually just reproduces, in some ways, it amplifies a racist common sense by way of
liberal.
And it also reproduces something else I think that we often under theorize, which is this kind of affective and visceral response we have to particular people's deaths, in which some are just become so unremarkable. As much as we critically comment on it, right, our stomach doesn't turn the same way as when we see innocent little white girls, being victimized, terrorized, and dismembered, and all the brutal things that happen. So that's why the empirical kind of stuff doesn't work for me anymore. I think there's a place for it, but I just don't think it's in any way adequate as a politics.
Well, I was interested in because it seems to be like for a lot of communities of color, the strategy right now. And that's happening in Latino communities too. We're growing by numbers, therefore,
exactly.
access to whatever. So I was interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah, exactly.
Could see it in a number of different contexts. Well, I had another quick question for Sarah. And this is another kind of aspect of...
I'm still thinking about the last question.
Did you want to comment? Did you want to comment on it?
No, I will ask Dylan more.
Okay. Okay. And this is another kind of, I don't know, maybe it's connected, but another form of property, because this is a personal question about the recordings that you shared. They were really powerful, you know. And I also had all these, you know, thoughts in my head about sound and memory and all of that. But I was just interested, like, who created these recordings, like how were they done, you know, in terms of, I mean, I thought just because of the time period, were they part of the race records kind of like moment?
They were part of the Works Progress Administration recordings.
Okay.
So WPA, you know, federal employees went to Parchment to take notes about the experience. Part of the recording of Southern history, right? The Southern folklore project that the WPA had. And they went there to record men's blues, right? This iconic American Southern sound. So the blues recording of male prisoners, and just before they leave, they say, oh, there's some women over there.
Wow.
And the women write down the lyrics to all of these songs they have created their entire time in prison, and some of them are recorded. And I actually just came across the lyrics. I previously only had the recordings.
Wow.
And so in addition to being, you know, additional material, it's interesting the extent to which the written lyrics diverge from the recordings.
Yeah.
Quite a bit.
Yeah.
Which I think, you know, says a lot about your area of expertise and how music is constructed and what sound means, and also to, right, the regime, as Dylan would say, right, that they were in. Right, and the amount of terror and violence, and what like a recorded documentation meant to them, and what the paper, and the literal.
Well, that's what was like fascinating to me, because once they're on paper, it's a different thing. You know, and like that period, you know, the blues especially is this form that's like it's passed down, it's oral, and it's like you know. So like I was real curious about, you know, how that happened, how they actually.
And there's a lot of engagement in the recordings between each other. Which is interesting. So
fascinating.
So we're at the end of our formal time. But I don't know that there is another presentation in here. So we can kind of take our time and to be honest, I would like to eavesdrop on your conversation.
I have a quick question.
Well, of course.
I was noticing, and I don't know if it's a formulated question, but I was just noticing that, like Dylan, you were talking about the white humanist fantasy, and Erica, you were talking about the Black princess fantasy of Condoleezza Rice. And then I was thinking about how Yasmin was talking about Harriet Jacobs' claim to the future, which we could maybe consider fantastical. So I was just wondering about the role of like imagination or fantasy in like abolition politics. If anybody had any.
And even in that recording, the Tell Your Midnight Dream.
That's I wrote that.
Yeah.
It seems like there's two different competing trajectories of fantasy, though, right? One in which you're a princess in the master's house, and the other one where you're dismantling it. So
I'm just curious, like where does the, or if you have any thoughts about like where does the difference come from, or like how does it get channeled?
Can I say something really quickly about that? Because I thought Yasmin's work was so amazing, in part, and I don't think this is the case anymore, but in part because there was such a notion, and I remember this years ago in Black studies and Black history, of Jacobs being right in a privileged position, right in the princess in a way, right, of slavery, right? You have this whole field house Negro, you know, dichotomy, and what you do is disrupt that and give us a genealogy that gets us to abolition via, you know, Davis's work, which I think is so important as a Black feminist project. So.
Anything else on fantasy?
No, I'm kind of with you on trying to, more than privilege that, but trying to understand or get my head around how it's a politics in and of itself. Right, that fantasy imagination. A lot of I was calling that. I was starting to try to refer to that as one element of what I would call the collective genius that comes out of sites of inhabitation of violence and genocidal conditions. But I think part of the collective genius is precisely articulated in the capacity to imagine and to fantasize. And sometimes the thing that is imagined and fantasized appears to those outside the condition of violence as being entirely mundane, right? So it doesn't get seen as fantastical. So when strikers at Pelican Bay, right, incarcerated strikers at Pelican Bay, articulate in their demands something around food, right, a challenge to the food regime or a challenge to familial separation, and alienation, in which one of the demands that always stands out to me is the demand for one photograph to be kept in the cell, right? That's actually a fantasy, right? So to the outside world of advocates and activists or whatever, it seems like, oh, there's just a bunch of performance demands that are kind of imitating Attica and whatnot. But I think it's kind of this mistranslation or misrecognition of the thing that you're naming in your question. So I'm all for. I think that's what politics actually is, by the way. I think all political struggle, especially with people that are struggling for freedom, liberation, etc., I think it's always and already a fantasy. It's always already imagination. So it's this weird thing that we do where we want to think about that as somehow outside the normal stream of what counts as the political, but I think an honest reckoning would understand it as being constitutive of the political, which also invites then the different kinds of things that people in this room address, from song to performance, to social movements that take place outside the organizational kind of archive of social movements, insurgencies and whatnot.
Anything else? Okay, I think that's the end of our.
Thank you. Thank you for moderating.
This was, you guys were great to have on law school.
Thanks to all the attendees. For a generous audience.
Extensive panel.
Oh, and those people up there on that surveillance camera. On the throne.
Thanks to you guys.
Yeah, deployment.